Today, we're taking a deep dive into a celebrity controversy that has been quietly, but steadily gaining traction online, a situation involving Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and a series of alleged text messages that some believe complicate the public understanding of their relationship and the narrative surrounding it. Before getting into the details, it's important to set clear boundaries around what we know and what we don't. Much of the conversation happening right now is based on unverified screenshots, second-hand reports, and public interpretation. There have been no official confirmations, no authenticated releases of the messages in question, and no direct statements validating their authenticity or full context. What we're examining today is not established fact, but rather the reaction, the speculation, and the broader implications of how these alleged messages are being received. Still, despite the lack of confirmation, the discussion has intensified, and at the center of that discussion is a single question many people keep asking: if these messages are real, do they conflict with what the public believes to be true? To understand why this question matters so much, we need to take a step back and look at the narrative that existed before these messages ever surfaced. For years, Blake Lively has been widely perceived as someone who is deliberate and confident in how she presents herself publicly. Through interviews, public appearances, and subtle moments of commentary, she has built an image of being self-aware, composed, and transparent. Many fans view her as someone who doesn't carefully script vulnerability for attention, but instead allows certain parts of her personal life to be visible, while still maintaining boundaries. That reputation matters, because it shapes how people interpret new information. Justin Baldoni, meanwhile, has cultivated a very different, but equally distinct public persona. He is often described as introspective, emotionally open, and deeply invested in conversations around growth, vulnerability, and self-reflection. His work, interviews, and public messaging consistently emphasize emotional honesty and personal accountability. This image has earned him both admiration and trust from a large segment of the public. And that's precisely why the alleged text messages have drawn so much attention. According to online discussions, screenshots began circulating that allegedly show Justin Baldoni communicating with another individual in a way that appears deeply personal and emotionally expressive. The tone of the messages, at least as they've been described, feels reflective, intimate, and layered with emotional weight. If these messages are authentic and accurately represented, some observers believe they suggest a level of emotional intimacy that doesn't immediately align with what many people assumed about his personal life at the time. And that's where speculation begins to take hold. Some people interpret the messages as evidence of unresolved emotions, perhaps lingering attachment, unfinished conversations, or emotional history that extends beyond what the public was aware of. Others see a completely different picture, suggesting the texts could reflect a long-standing friendship, a mature exchange between former partners, or a selective snapshot pulled from a much longer, more nuanced conversation. Without full context, it's impossible to know which interpretation, if any, is accurate. Once the messages entered the public conversation, however, attention shifted quickly. The focus moved away from the messages themselves and toward how they might intersect with Blake Lively's public narrative. The central question wasn't simply, what do these messages say? It became, how do these messages fit into the story we've already been told? If Blake Lively's public statements or implied narratives suggested clarity, emotional closure, or a straightforward timeline, then these alleged messages appeared, at least to some, to introduce ambiguity. Not proof of wrongdoing, not evidence of dishonesty, but complication. And complication is often enough to fuel controversy. It's important to emphasize that complexity does not equal contradiction. Private lives are rarely linear, and emotional timelines don't always align neatly with public assumptions. A private conversation, especially one stripped of tone, timing, and context, does not automatically invalidate someone else's experience or perspective. Still, online commentary doesn't always leave room for nuance. Some critics began suggesting that if the messages are real, they raise questions about timing. Others wondered whether certain details were missing from the public story, not necessarily hidden, but simply not shared. A smaller but more vocal group went further, framing the situation as a contradiction, or even a credibility issue. Supporters of Blake Lively responded just as strongly. They pointed out that private messages, particularly when shared without consent or full context, are one of the least reliable indicators of truth. A single emotional exchange doesn't define a relationship, and it certainly doesn't negate someone else's lived experience. They also emphasized that the alleged messages don't appear to reference Blake Lively directly, nor do they clearly establish Justin Baldoni's relationship status at the time they were sent, assuming they were sent at all. That distinction is crucial. At the same time, critics argued that perception plays an outsized role in celebrity culture. Even unverified material can influence how people reinterpret past statements, especially when no clarifying response follows. And silence has been one of the most discussed aspects of this situation. Neither Blake Lively nor her team has issued a public statement addressing the alleged messages. Justin Baldoni has also remained silent. There have been no denials, no confirmations, no clarifications. For some observers, that silence is entirely understandable. Responding to rumors can sometimes give them more visibility and legitimacy. For others, the lack of response feels unsatisfying, even suspicious, though there is no evidence to suggest it should be interpreted that way. This tension between privacy and public curiosity is nothing new, but it feels particularly sharp here, because of the emotional tone attributed to the messages. The texts are often described as thoughtful, expressive, and deeply personal qualities that align closely with Justin Baldoni's public image. For some fans, this alignment reinforces his authenticity. They see emotional openness not as a red flag, but as consistency. Others disagree, arguing that emotional expression doesn't automatically equal transparency, especially when only fragments of a conversation are visible. Then there's the question that underpins the entire controversy: motive. Why did these messages surface now? Who shared them? Why were they released? Were they selectively edited or presented? And perhaps most importantly, are they even real? At this point, those questions remain unanswered. It's also worth examining how quickly online narratives can solidify. Once a storyline takes hold, particularly one involving perceived contradiction or emotional intrigue, it becomes increasingly difficult to reverse, even if new information emerges later. In Blake Lively's case, some commentators have gone as far as suggesting that her public image could be affected if the messages are confirmed and interpreted unfavorably. Others strongly disagree, arguing that speculation should not outweigh years of consistent behavior, credibility, and public trust. The truth likely exists somewhere between these extremes, or somewhere we can't yet see. What this situation ultimately highlights is a broader issue within celebrity culture: the way private communication is often weaponized once it enters the public sphere. Context disappears, nuance fades, assumptions multiply. A text message, stripped of tone, timing, emotional background, and surrounding conversation, can be interpreted in countless ways. Add fame, loyalty, bias, and social media amplification into the mix, and those interpretations quickly become headlines. As of now, there is no verified evidence that Justin Baldoni's alleged messages directly contradict anything Blake Lively has explicitly stated. There is also no proof that anyone involved has been dishonest or misleading. What exists instead is a gap between what the public knows and what the public assumes. And until that gap is filled with confirmed information, everything else remains speculation. So, does this situation ruin Blake Lively's claims? At this moment, that question doesn't have a definitive answer. The claims, the messages, and the interpretations surrounding them have not been fully substantiated. What this situation does reveal is how quickly perception can shift when partial information enters the conversation, and how fragile public trust can become when silence meets speculation. For now, the story remains unfinished. As more details emerge, if they do, the narrative may shift again. Until then, this serves as a reminder to approach celebrity drama with caution, patience, and a willingness to separate curiosity from certainty. The conversation will continue, but the facts, as of now, remain incomplete. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.